Exactly 72 hours ago, something happened that should not exist inside any recorded spiritual framework. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was loud, but because it violated the deepest rule governing power itself. God did not stop time. He did not intervene. He did not warn you. He paused to observe, because what unfolded was not an act of rebellion, not an act of obedience, but an act of internal alignment so precise that even divine expectation did not account for it. And the one who understood this first was not heaven, it was hell. The devil did not fall because you attacked him. He did not bend because you challenged him. He did not retreat because you prayed harder than others. He knelt because you operated from a level of internal order he could not access, distort, or negotiate with. This was not poetry. This was not exaggeration. This was a recorded reaction inside the non-physical dimension that overlaps this one at all times. Witnessed, documented, analyzed, and now, slowly, being disclosed to you because the sequence has already completed. You were not aware of it while it happened. You were living your normal day, maybe tired, maybe distracted, maybe dealing with pressures that felt small compared to the weight you carry constantly. That is what made it more disturbing to the observers. You were not preparing for a confrontation. You were not performing. You were not trying to prove anything. You simply moved through a decision point with a kind of internal precision that exposed something ancient and unresolved in the structure of darkness itself. The devil does not kneel. This is not about arrogance, this is about design. His entire identity was built on refusal. When humanity was created and celestial beings were instructed to acknowledge this new form of consciousness, he evaluated it and rejected the command. Not out of hatred, out of hierarchy. To him, bending before a form that could suffer, forget, and die was an unacceptable inversion of power. He chose exile rather than compliance. He chose distance rather than recognition. That choice hardened into identity. For thousands of years, it defined every move he made. He lost battles. He was resisted. His plans were exposed, but he never bent. Not to prophets, not to warriors, not to those who gave up everything in devotion. Even when defeated, he withdrew intact, already calculating the next angle. Submission was not an option in his internal structure. Until you crossed a line without knowing there was a line to cross. Hell has protocols, observation layers, filters that scan human consciousness for particular configurations. Most people never register. Some flicker briefly. A few get flagged. Weeks ago, your profile escalated. Not because you were powerful, not because you were visible, but because you displayed something that destabilizes prediction, a form of integrity that does not depend on reward, fear, or recognition. That alone triggered enhanced attention. You remember the moment. You don't need to pretend you don't. It wasn't dramatic, no music, no witnesses, just you and a decision that felt unfair in how quiet it was. The easy option would have solved real problems. It would not have ruined anyone. It would not have crossed any obvious moral boundary. Most people would not even pause. But you did. Not because you are cautious, because something inside you refuses alignment with outcomes that feel internally distorted, even if the distortion is subtle. You argued with yourself, you calculated, you tried to justify, you looked for permission, and eventually you chose the harder path. Not with confidence, but with a kind of tired clarity. You told yourself it didn't matter, that it was just one decision, that no one would ever know. You were wrong. That decision was classified immediately. Not as good behavior, not as virtue, as a threat. The internal rating applied to you is rare. It indicates a consciousness that maintains internal order under pressure without external enforcement. There are very few of these active at any given time. The reason is simple. Most beings, when pushed hard enough, eventually trade principles for relief. Hunger breaks people. Isolation breaks people. Fear breaks people. You demonstrated that discomfort increases your alignment instead of eroding it. That alone demanded further testing. So the pressure increased, not dramatically, elegantly. Something entered your life that looked like relief, perfect timing, clean delivery, minimal cost. It did not arrive as temptation. It arrived as an answer. It solved multiple problems at once. It made sense. Anyone advising you logically would have told you to take it. You even started leaning toward it. And then something deeper intervened. Not guilt, not fear. A rejection that moved faster than thought. That is when the internal alarms escalated. Because this was no longer coincidence. You were not reacting emotionally. You were not acting impulsively. You are operating from a core alignment that overrides survival logic, that breaks predictive modeling completely. When beings cannot be predicted, they cannot be controlled. And when they cannot be controlled, they must be confronted. An internal review was initiated, high level, comprehensive. Every leverage point was examined. Desire, status, recognition, security, attachment. None of them behaved as expected. Pressure increased again, this time through justified resentment. Someone who wronged you became exposed. The opportunity was real. The justification was complete. You would not have been blamed. You would have been praised. And you felt it. The pull. The satisfaction that would have come from balancing the scales. And you let it pass, not because you forgave them, not because you forgot what they did, but because something inside you refuses to become what hurt you, even when the transformation would feel deserved. That moment caused something rare, internal hesitation inside hell's command structure, because resentment is one of their most reliable engines. It turns pain into propagation. You interrupted that chain without effort, without performance, without explanation. At that point, the devil understood he was not dealing with resistance. He was dealing with a structure he could not enter. Every attempt to apply pressure resulted in reinforcement instead of fracture. That is when direct engagement was authorized. Not through coincidence, not through other people, through thought. You remember it. The thought that arrived fully formed, reasonable, respectful, offering collaboration rather than control. It did not ask you to abandon who you are. It suggested efficiency. It framed compromise as necessity. It offered power without asking for worship. It sounded mature, balanced, strategic, and you rejected it instantly. There was no debate, no internal discussion, no delay. Your internal alignment responded before your mind could participate. That response was registered, measured, and understood for what it was. You are not someone who follows a moral code. You are someone whose structure is the code. It is not something you consult. It is something you are. At that moment, the devil faced a problem he could not solve. Continued pressure would expose weakness. Withdrawal would confirm limitation. There is a final protocol reserved for encounters with forces that cannot be bent, bypassed, or absorbed. It is not used lightly. It is not symbolic. It is recognition through physical submission within the non-physical domain. And that is what occurred. Not dramatically, precisely. The act sent shockwaves through every layer of that domain, not because of spectacle, but because it rewrote hierarchy. When a being whose entire identity is built on refusal bends, it signals the presence of an authority that operates outside known categories, heaven observed, not to intervene, to verify. The archangels did not arrive to rescue you. They arrived because a human consciousness had done something no organized force had achieved. You did not overpower. You did not dominate. You remained intact. That is what they came to see. God did not speak immediately. Observation preceded declaration, because what was being evaluated was not behavior, it was essence. And when the conclusion was reached, the response was not praise, it was activation. You have felt the early signs already, subtle shifts, old pressures loosening without confrontation, certain connections thinning naturally, moments of clarity appearing without effort. This is not reward, it is alignment beginning to remove internal restrictions that were deliberately in place. You were not placed here to be comfortable. You were placed here to operate. And before this life, before memory, before fear, you understood exactly what that meant. You volunteered for a condition few accept, to enter limitation without recall, to experience vulnerability without reinforcement, to see whether your internal structure would hold when stripped of certainty. You were not sent to dominate environments or command attention. You were sent to test whether your internal order would remain intact when no one was watching, when nothing was promised, when the world offered no reassurance that doing the right thing would be rewarded. That was the condition. That was the risk. And that was the reason the observation intensified rather than softened as your life progressed. Because you were not being tested for performance. You were being tested for consistency under erosion. Most beings can appear aligned when conditions are supportive. Remove the support and alignment collapses. That is the common pattern. You were placed into circumstances designed to do the opposite. Delayed outcomes, ambiguous results, pressure without explanation. Repeated moments where compromise would have made things easier without appearing destructive. Each one calibrated precisely to measure whether your center would drift. It did not. And when it became apparent to the forces of darkness that the usual levers, temptation, distraction, resentment, envy, produced no movement within you, their attention sharpened, not because they expected failure, but because the absence of reaction is far more difficult to calculate, far more dangerous to models that rely on predictability. Every time a situation presented itself that would crack others, you did not bend. You did not yield. You did not rationalize or justify compromise. You evaluated and acted according to a principle set so deeply integrated that even survival instincts had to defer. The devil recognized this. He could see it unfolding in subtle ways, the way you paused before action, the way hesitation was not fear, but calculation. He noted every internal struggle and saw nothing break. That was the moment he began to reconsider. That was the moment the concept of submission, or his perception of invulnerability, started to wobble. Hell's observation is precise. Every anomaly triggers immediate reassessment, and you had become an anomaly in the highest degree. Small interventions, perfectly timed opportunities, subtle manipulations that would have ensnared anyone else, failed repeatedly. Each refusal was not impulsive. Each act of restraint was not accidental. Each decision was observed, processed, catalogued, and each one pointed to a fundamental problem. Your integrity could not be leveraged, your mind could not be predicted, and your spirit could not be bent. You were isolated, yes, That was intentional. Isolation intensifies the calibration process. It allows every micro-choice to carry weight, every subtle alignment to be tested. You faced decisions where there was no audience, where the wrong choice would go unnoticed, where the cost was internal and immediate. Yet every time, you chose coherence over convenience, integrity over pragmatism, and principle over satisfaction. Those moments, invisible to human eyes, were visible to all higher orders, and they mattered more than you could imagine. The devil, accustomed to seeing human weakness exploited effortlessly, realized that he was confronting something unique, not rare, not unusual, but entirely unprecedented in the span of recorded infernal observation. For the first time, he faced a consciousness that could not be assessed through conventional methods. Intelligence, cunning, charm, coercion, all of it failed to provoke the smallest deviation from your internal code. Every test was failing. And when the testing failed, he understood what it meant. He was no longer in control. 72 hours ago, everything changed. Not through spectacle, not through drama, not through announcement. It changed through acknowledgement. You do not perform to impress. You do not manipulate to control. You operate within a coherence so absolute that recognition becomes inevitable. The devil understood that recognition was the only viable response left. And in a moment that would echo through all dimensions for the next 6 millennia, he knelt. He knelt not because he was tricked, not because he was overpowered, not because he was coerced, but because he saw in you a consciousness that existed outside the realm of his influence. That act of kneeling, physically and spiritually, was unprecedented, and the shockwaves of that action were observed immediately by the highest celestial authorities. God did not intervene directly. God observed, and when the devil bent the knee, even God rose, not as a gesture to glorify you, but as acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. What you manifested was a level of incorruptible integrity so rare, so fundamentally unbreakable, that the natural order itself had to recalibrate. Angels whispered to each other in recognition. Archangels paused mid-action. Heaven witnessed an event that had never occurred and may never occur again. This is not exaggeration. The forces of darkness have a predictive matrix built on human tendencies, on reactionary behavior, on the assumption that survival instinct overrides principle. Every model failed in your case. Every calculation collapsed. Because you acted in alignment with an internal structure that exists beyond fear, beyond reward, beyond consequence. That structure is the reason the devil had no choice but to kneel. That structure is the reason God stood. That structure is the reason history itself shifted quietly, invisibly, in that very instant. Let us examine why this is so significant. Humans have long believed that power is external, that influence is a product of coercion, manipulation, or advantage. What you demonstrated is different. Influence can exist entirely from integrity. Power can exist entirely from consistency. The capacity to act without compromise, without expectation, without visibility, produces leverage that cannot be countered by deception or force. That is exactly what the devil observed. 3 weeks ago, you triggered a response across multiple dimensions that are designed to detect integrity anomalies. That alert indicated that your moral code operates at a level that transcends immediate gain or loss. Only a select few individuals, less than 24 in the entire human population at any given time, exhibit this configuration. The classification is not a badge. It is a designation. It signals to higher orders that you are operationally incorruptible, tactically unbreakable, and strategically unyielding. That designation is why what follows is not random. It is coordinated, it is deliberate, it is inevitable in its activation. Your actions, small, discrete, personal choices, were observed and analyzed. Every decision to refuse compromise, to maintain integrity despite internal conflict, to forego immediate satisfaction, created a chain reaction. These were not external rewards. These were structural recalibrations across the infernal and celestial planes. Every refusal realigned priorities, reshaped observation protocols, and forced the devil to reconsider his entire approach. Even the offer you received 7 days ago, the one that could have delivered revenge, recognition, or gratification, was an engineered test. It was the culmination of infernal calculations designed to evaluate the limits of your moral architecture. Most would seize such a moment without hesitation. Most would rationalize, justify, or manipulate circumstances to exploit opportunity. You did none of that. You allowed the moment to pass. You forgave through action, not thought. You rejected through alignment, not reaction. And that rejection was witnessed, recorded, and analyzed at the highest levels. Consider the significance. Revenge is one of the most powerful tools of darkness. It creates cycles. It produces energy that sustains corruption and prolongs suffering. When a soul refuses it, even when justified, even when necessary for survival, the patterns of perpetuated pain are broken. You are immune to a mechanism designed to bind countless generations. That immunity triggered panic, recalibration, and acknowledgement. The second recognition came in the form of direct observation by the entire infernal court. Thousands of entities, supreme commanders, and dark strategists convened to analyze a phenomenon they could neither manipulate nor control. They discovered 3 qualities coexisting in a single consciousness that they had previously believed impossible. Strength to endure extreme suffering without collapse, integrity impervious to corruption under any circumstance, and compassion that transforms rather than perpetuates pain. That trinity is what prompted the ultimate concession, the devil kneeling. When he knelt, it was a structural acknowledgement, not symbolic, not theatrical. He recognized that his standard operating procedures no longer applied. He recognized that your existence, your coherence, your unbreakable moral code placed you outside the conventional rules of engagement. That acknowledgement is not easily conveyed in human terms. It is operational, structural, and consequential. It reverberates across dimensions, signaling a shift in the balance of influence. God's response was aligned, not performative. The archangels observed the same event. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel. All 4 commanders recognized the significance. Michael noted the internal strength demonstrated under invisible pressure. Gabriel observed coherence unbroken by temptation. Raphael confirmed the alchemical transformation of pain into actionable compassion. Uriel clarified that true power is not in destruction, but in preservation of integrity, when destruction would be easier. Their observations were not commentary. They were confirmation of structural activation, acknowledgement that a celestial protocol had reached completion. Your function is no longer latent. Activation has begun. Not as sensation, not as spectacle, as structural alignment. Opportunities, resources, connections, these begin to coordinate precisely, not through chance, but through deliberate orchestration. Your life no longer requires struggle to validate. It requires presence to propagate. Each decision, each interaction, each visible act of integrity compounds. transmitting coherence to others without direct instruction. Your influence spreads silently. People around you recalibrate without realizing it. Observers, collaborators, even casual contacts begin to align unconsciously. They hesitate before compromise. They act with greater honesty. They measure consequences more carefully. This is the natural propagation of integrity as a functional force. You are a node in a network that is forming, a network of like-operating individuals whose alignment cannot be countered through ordinary mechanisms of control. The forces of darkness recognize this and adjust. Noise increases elsewhere. Distraction amplifies. Manipulation escalates. But you remain insulated. Not by luck, not by fear, not by avoidance, but by operating consistently within the structural integrity that forced the kneeling in the first place. That is the nature of your power. It is immune to external disruption because it is reinforced internally and validated structurally. You are not here to fight. You are here to anchor. You are here to operate coherently where others would compromise. You are here to allow presence to propagate change. And that is why the kneeling occurred. That is why God rose. That is why the archangels confirmed. That is why history in this life now bears a new vector. This operation is ongoing. Activation continues. Fragments of memory, insight, and strategic understanding return, not as instruction, but as structural recall. You recognize patterns, connections, and functions you have already mastered, now applied through human context. The operation does not pause. You now participate consciously in a protocol designed to propagate coherence across influence networks that affect the collective trajectory of human decision-making. From this point, nothing in ordinary perception can deter progress. Financial structures, relational dynamics, and environmental pressures adjust in response to integrity that is visible and active. Opportunities arrive precisely when conditions are right. Resistance manifests as noise, never as disruption. And every observer who witnesses your consistency recalibrates, amplifying the effect. You are no longer an isolated individual. You are a node, a reference, a catalyst. And that is why the next phase will not announce itself. It will arrive as a subtle alignment, a precise opening, a situation that looks ordinary until it is engaged. You will know what to do, because recognition is now part of your structural operating system. And here's where the story stops being flattering and starts becoming dangerous to everything that once measured itself against you. Because the moment recognition becomes internal, external power structures lose their leverage. The devil never feared strength. He feared alignment. He never trembled at rage. He recoiled from clarity. Pride only survives where confusion exists. And you removed confusion without raising your voice. This is the part no one prepares you for. The aftermath of refusing the game while still winning it. You didn't confront darkness with light like a cartoon myth. You didn't fight temptation by pretending it didn't exist. You looked at it, you understood it, you outgrew it. And that is what made the devil kneel. Not submission, not obedience, but irrelevance. Pride collapses when it realizes it no longer defines the axis. That's why the old forces started malfunctioning around you. Why provocation lost its timing. Why intimidation arrived late and left early. Why threats suddenly sounded like rehearsed lines read by actors who forgot the plot. God didn't intervene because there was nothing to correct. That's the shock. The applause wasn't for obedience. It was for mastery, for discernment, For the rare moment, a human doesn't outsource responsibility upward or downward, but stands in the middle and stabilizes the entire structure by refusing distortion. You didn't ask for permission, you didn't ask for protection, you didn't beg for signs. You became the sign. That's why heaven went quiet for a second, not in concern, but in recognition. When alignment replaces desperation, even divine systems pause to observe. Understand this clearly. You didn't defeat the devil by overpowering him. You defeated him by breaking his favorite mirror. Pride needs reflection. It needs reaction. It needs you to measure yourself against it. You stopped measuring. You stopped performing resistance. You stopped narrating your struggle. And the moment the narrative collapsed, so did the throne. That's why kneeling wasn't dramatic. It was mechanical. Like a machine realizing it's no longer plugged into a power source. This is also why people around you feel unsettled without knowing why. They sense something concluded, something finished without ceremony. Humans are addicted to arcs: rise, fall, redemption, punishment. You skipped the spectacle. You reached resolution quietly. And when someone resolves internally, every external hierarchy that depended on their seeking collapses. That's why the world around you feels like it's recalibrating its posture. It's not reacting to your actions. It's responding to your absence of need. The devil thrives on leverage. God honors responsibility. You stepped into the narrow space where leverage dissolves and responsibility stabilizes. That's not rebellion, that's maturity. And maturity is the one thing pride cannot counterfeit. Pride can mimic confidence. It can mimic authority. It can mimic certainty. It cannot mimic peace without sedation. You walked into peace, fully awake. That's what caused the kneel. Now the applause, don't romanticize it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was recognition across layers of reality that rarely acknowledge one another. When a human stops asking to be saved and starts acting as a steward of clarity, something ancient nods. Not because you surpassed God, but because you finally stopped projecting him as an excuse. You didn't demand intervention. You embodied principle. And principle is what the entire system runs on. This is why the next movements will feel strangely small. Conversations that seem casual. Decisions that look mundane. Doors that don't glow or creak ominously. But understand, this is post-conflict terrain. The war everyone else is still narrating already ended for you. Pride was broken at the root, not the branch. The devil didn't retreat. He recalculated away from you. And God didn't command. He observed and approved. You may notice temptations still appear, but they'll feel hollow, like old costumes without actors. You may notice challenges still arise, but they won't carry existential weight. Because once pride kneels, fear loses its interpreter. And once fear loses its interpreter, it becomes background noise. That's the real victory no one talks about. Not domination, not righteousness theater, silence where noise used to govern behavior. And that silence is not empty. It is not passive. It is not peace as an escape. It is peace as authority. This is where most people misunderstand what just happened to you. They think the danger is over because the tension is gone. They think the devil kneeling means temptation vanished. No, temptation still shows up. Ego still whispers, chaos still circles, but none of it can enter the command center anymore. Because command requires consent, and you revoked it without ceremony. This is why the devil's pride broke instead of his power. Power can survive rejection. Pride cannot survive indifference. You didn't shame it. You didn't expose it publicly. You didn't try to dominate it with moral theatrics. You simply stopped orienting yourself around it. And when something built its entire identity on being your axis, losing that role is annihilation. Kneeling was the only position left once relevance collapsed. And God's reaction, this is the part people struggle to digest. They expect judgment. They expect reward. They expect a crown handed down dramatically. But what happened instead was recognition of alignment. God stood not because you begged correctly, not because you suffered loudly, not because you followed a script. He stood because you finally understood the assignment without needing supervision. You didn't outsource integrity. You internalized it. And systems far older than religion recognize that shift instantly. Now notice how the world engages you differently, not louder, quieter. People don't challenge you head-on anymore. They test indirectly. They probe. They poke at the edges. They try to reinsert friction where it used to work. But the friction doesn't catch. Because you are no longer operating on emotional torque. You're operating on orientation. And orientation doesn't get dragged. It sets direction, regardless of resistance. This is where the applause actually matters. It wasn't approval in the human sense, it was confirmation that the structure held, that a human can encounter temptation, power, ego, darkness, divinity, and not fracture into dependency or rebellion. That's rare. That's why heaven paused, not in shock at rebellion, but in respect for containment. You didn't leak chaos upward. You didn't project blame downward. You absorbed complexity and remained intact. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This makes you dangerous in a way violence never could. Because you don't need conflict to justify yourself. You don't need enemies to feel real. You don't need validation to move. Pride feeds on reaction. Fear feeds on urgency. You offer neither. So when people say, "Damn, bro, you made the devil kneel," what they're really sensing is this: nothing in you is pulling for attention anymore. And that unsettles everything trained to manipulate attention. You'll notice moments where you could exploit situations easily. Where old instincts would say, "Now strike, now dominate, now prove." But you won't feel compelled. Not because you're weaker, but because you're no longer hungry. Hunger is leverage. You starved the system by feeding yourself correctly. That's the part no one wants to replicate, because it requires giving up the dopamine of struggle narratives. Even God's applause wasn't encouragement to continue performing. It was acknowledgement that performance ended, that the training wheels came off, that you no longer need dramatic reinforcement to stay aligned. You don't need signs because you don't doubt direction. And direction, once stabilized, creates momentum without force. This is why things start lining up quietly around you. Opportunities don't rush you. Threats don't rush you. Time itself seems less aggressive. Now understand this clearly. The devil didn't disappear. He adjusted. He avoids you now, the way gamblers avoid tables where the odds no longer bend. Pride doesn't fight battles it can't narrate. And your life has become unnarratable to that frequency. There's no hook, no weakness to exaggerate, no insecurity to amplify. That's why temptations feel like props. They show up out of habit, not strategy. And the reason God stood, this matters, is because stewardship replaced dependency. You didn't become holy by detaching from the world. You became grounded within it. You didn't ask God to remove the devil. You learned how not to feed him. That's evolution. That's why the applause wasn't emotional. It was structural, like an architect watching a load-bearing column finally hold on its own. This is also why some people will misinterpret you now. They'll say you're cold, detached, uninterested. They'll mistake your silence for arrogance or apathy. Let them. Pride always accuses clarity of cruelty. But you're not cruel. You're precise. You don't over-explain. You don't overreact. You don't over-identify. And over anything is where manipulation enters. The war didn't end with fireworks. It ended with posture, with you standing still while everything that once needed your reaction lost balance. The devil knelt because he couldn't provoke motion. God stood because motion was no longer required. And you remained seated in yourself, unimpressed, unthreatened, unavailable to distortion. So this is the final understanding, the last calibration of this script. You are not here to dominate darkness or perform holiness. You are here to render pride obsolete by refusing to orbit it. That's why the title isn't exaggeration. You didn't overpower the devil. You broke his pride, and pride is the throne. Break that, and the figure kneels automatically. And God's applause. It wasn't surprise at your strength. It was recognition of your maturity, of a human who finally stopped confusing guidance with control, faith with fear, obedience with erasure. You didn't disappear into divinity. You embodied responsibility. And that's the one thing both heaven and hell respond to instantly. This is not the beginning of your rise. This is the confirmation that the ascent already stabilized. No more announcements, no more declarations, no more proving. The system adjusted, the devil recalculated, God acknowledged, and you continue quietly, untouchable, not because you're protected, but because you're aligned. That's the ending, not with noise, but with gravity. They didn't expect this turn. They didn't expect the shift. They didn't expect people to finally see through the act, the performance, the fabricated narratives built behind the scenes. For so long, they relied on exaggerations, accusations, whispers thrown into the air like bait. They assumed everyone would swallow the version of events they manufactured. They thought your image was something they could sculpt according to their convenience. But something unexpected happened, something they never calculated. People started paying attention, not to them, not to their stories, but to you, to the way you move, to the way you speak, to the way you carry yourself under pressure, to the way you respond without flinching. And that observation alone began creating ripples that terrified the ones who tried to distort your name. Because for the first time, people aren't just watching. They're speaking, they're comparing, they're connecting dots, they're defending you without you asking, they're correcting the narrative for you. And that is something your opponents never prepared for. They assumed that once they twisted the storyline, it would stay twisted. They assumed that once they claimed something, others would never question it. But people started noticing inconsistencies. They noticed the desperation behind the accusations. They noticed how the loudest critics were the ones with the weakest credibility. They noticed how every claim against you fell apart when looked at closely. And the more they examined, the more the truth started becoming unavoidable. People are recognizing the pattern. They're seeing how calm you've been, even when you had every reason to retaliate. They're seeing how steady you've stayed, even when the environment around you was built to provoke a reaction. They're seeing how grounded you are, even when lies were crafted to push you off balance. That contrast alone has done more for your reputation than any self-defense statement ever could. Your composure became your strongest argument. Your consistency became your shield. And your patience became the proof people needed to understand who was honest and who wasn't. You didn't force anyone to side with you. You didn't recruit supporters. You didn't beg for validation. You simply lived your truth while others tried to distort it. And that truth has now started speaking louder than any accusation ever could. People have begun defending you because they finally understand something that took time to reveal itself. The ones who attacked you never had evidence. They only had bitterness, fear, and a desire to drag you down before you could rise. People now realize the difference between someone with genuine intentions and someone who acts out of insecurity. And that realization is reshaping the entire narrative. The irony is powerful. The same individuals who tried to create a negative image of you are the ones now struggling to hold their own credibility together, because every defense made in your favor exposes them a little more. Every voice rising for you weakens their influence. Every person standing by your side becomes a spotlight on their dishonesty. And they feel it. They feel the losing battle. They feel the momentum shift. They feel their fabricated foundation cracking. They feel the pressure of accountability approaching. And nothing terrifies a liar more than a collective awakening. You are becoming the person people want to rally behind. Not because you asked for support, but because your integrity forced people to pay attention. People are realizing that you didn't shrink, you didn't retaliate impulsively, you didn't degrade yourself trying to fight rumors. You outclassed the entire situation simply by being who you truly are. And that is what created this shift. Your opponents underestimated how powerful authenticity becomes when placed next to manipulation. They thought their noise would overshadow your truth. Instead, your truth muted their noise. People are saying things like, "Hold on, that doesn't add up." Why would they say that about someone who's been consistent for so long? Wait a second. Look at how calm they are compared to how erratic the accusers are. These observations matter. They matter because they indicate something deeper. People are forming their own conclusions based on logic, not gossip. Based on behavior, not rumors. Based on energy, not exaggerations. People trust what they can feel, and the energy you project is grounded, stable, sincere. The energy your opponents project is reactive, chaotic, forced. And everyone senses the difference. This is the moment that changes everything. This is the moment where people stop absorbing lies and start analyzing motives. This is the moment where the weak attempts to smear your character become the very reason people start admiring your strength. Because people aren't blind. They may be slow to catch on sometimes, but they are never permanently fooled. They observe patterns. They evaluate behavior. They see who speaks from clarity and who speaks from insecurity. And the contrast between you and your critics has become impossible to ignore. You know what's even more interesting? People are defending you, even when you're silent. Even when you haven't said a word in your own favor. Even when you've chosen distance over conflict. That alone has shifted the entire conversation. Because when someone is guilty, they fight desperately. They rush to clear their name. They scramble to make explanations. They overreact to every small comment. You didn't do any of that. You stayed composed. And now people are interpreting that composure correctly. They see it as confidence in your truth. They see it as strength. They see it as emotional control. They see it as the behavior of someone who doesn't need to prove anything. Your enemies, however, are exhibiting the opposite. They can't stop talking. They can't stop trying to justify themselves. They can't stop repeating the same claims in hopes that someone out there will still buy into it. But the more they speak, the more obvious their insecurity becomes. Their words expose them. Their tone exposes them. Their inconsistencies expose them. And because of that, people are no longer just doubting them, they're actively defending you against them. And the best part is, your role in this shift is incredibly simple. You didn't fight for a narrative. You didn't wrestle for public opinion. You didn't argue for validation. You simply allowed people to see the truth through your behavior. That's the type of influence that can't be faked. It can't be bought. It can't be manipulated. It can only be earned. And you earned it by staying aligned with who you are even while you were being misjudged. People are defending you because your strength taught them something. It taught them that the calmest person in the room is usually the one telling the truth. It taught them that false accusations crumble when the accused refuses to panic. It taught them that integrity always reveals itself, even if it takes time. And it taught them that your opponents were more invested in tearing you down than in living their own lives with honesty. Now the ones who once whispered against you are whispering in your support. The same people who doubted you are now saying, "Wait, maybe we judged too quickly." The same individuals who once believed lies are now analyzing every detail and realizing they were fed narratives based on jealousy and insecurity. And that's what has ignited this movement of people defending you. Because when the truth becomes clear, people naturally gravitate toward the one who was wronged. It's fascinating how tables turn. You didn't flip them. Reality flipped them for you. Your opponents handed themselves over to accountability without even realizing it. They tried to create distance between you and the world. But in doing so, they highlighted your character for the world to witness. They tried to highlight your flaws, but all they highlighted was their own desperation. They tried to ruin your reputation, but they strengthened it by revealing how threatened they were by you. And now you're stepping into an unexpected advantage. People aren't just seeing your truth, they're protecting it. They're guarding your name. They're shutting down false claims before they spread. They're correcting misinformation immediately. They're calling out inconsistencies. They're exposing lies as soon as they appear. Your supporters aren't passive. They're active. They're alert. They're aware. And their awareness is growing by the day. The people defending you don't just believe you. They align with you energetically. They resonate with your calm. They appreciate your restraint. They respect your dignity. They admire how you carried yourself through something designed to weaken you. And that admiration is creating something powerful around you. An invisible shield. A shield of clarity. A shield of recognition. A shield built not from words, but from the impression you've left on people's minds. You are no longer someone they simply observe. You are someone they stand beside. And this is only the beginning of what happens when truth starts surfacing from all directions. You don't need to force the next stage. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to do anything drastic. The momentum is already shifting for you. The path is already clearing ahead of you. And as this shift continues, something even stronger begins forming behind the scenes. Something that takes this situation into its next evolution, where people not only defend you, but begin to actively correct the rewritten narrative, piece by piece, exposing what was hidden, questioning what was accepted, and challenging what was blindly believed. Because now, something different is happening, something your opponents never saw coming. People aren't just defending you casually. They're doing it with conviction. They're doing it with evidence. They're doing it with deliberate intention. They're bringing up timelines. They're pointing out inconsistencies. They're showing how every claim against you was rooted in exaggeration, insecurity, or personal grievance. They're identifying patterns in the behavior of those who attacked you. And this isn't random support. This is collective recognition. It's the kind of recognition that forms naturally when the truth becomes too loud to ignore. People are revisiting past events with fresh eyes. They're rereading messages. They're recalling conversations. They're remembering moments that didn't make sense before, but now fit perfectly into the puzzle. Suddenly, the version of events that once seemed believable begins to crumble. The false narrative collapses under the pressure of collective reasoning. People are realizing that the ones who tried to frame you as the problem were projecting their own issues onto you. They're realizing they were manipulated into seeing you through someone else's fear. And that realization is powerful enough to shift the entire balance of this situation. There's a specific moment in every conflict where perception flips, where the mask slips, where the audience stops questioning the innocent and starts questioning the accuser. You are entering that moment now. People are watching the reactions of those who attacked you, and something feels off to them. They're noticing the emotional instability behind their words. They're noticing the defensive over-explanations. They're noticing how every time someone speaks in your defense, the critics respond with agitation instead of clarity. And that agitation alone tells people everything they need to know. When someone is guilty, they fear exposure. When someone is wrong, they fear accountability. When someone builds their identity on tearing another person down, any challenge to their narrative feels like a threat. And that is exactly what is happening now. The people who once felt confident speaking against you are suddenly scrambling. They can feel the collective shift in the atmosphere. They can sense that they're losing control of the story they built. And nothing terrifies them more than the idea of being seen without their mask. Meanwhile, you, without saying a word, are gaining support from every angle. And this support isn't shallow, it's rooted. People defending you now have reasons. They have observations. They have clarity. They have evidence. They have their own experiences that align with your truth. This isn't about favoritism. This isn't about picking sides blindly. This is about logical recognition, emotional recognition, social recognition. People who once stayed neutral are stepping forward, not because you asked, but because they feel compelled to protect accuracy. They feel compelled to correct distortions. They feel compelled to stand with the person who carried themselves with dignity instead of desperation. This is what authenticity does. It attracts alignment without effort. It earns loyalty without asking. It builds protection without manipulation. Your integrity has become a magnet, pulling the right voices closer, while exposing the ones who operate through deception. And the more people speak in your favor, the more the truth spreads through conversations you'll never witness. Group discussions, private chats, quiet observations. Your name is being spoken with respect that in places you don't even know. That's the type of influence only truth can create. And when people talk, they talk with detail. They bring up how you handled things. They mention your restraint. They talk about moments when you could have retaliated, but chose not to. They talk about how your behavior stayed consistent even under pressure. They talk about how the ones accusing you couldn't maintain that same consistency. They mention the body language, the tones, the timing. They talk about how whenever anyone questioned the attackers, the story kept shifting. They talk about how every time you were confronted, your story stayed the same. That consistency is becoming the anchor in every conversation about you. Your calm became undeniable evidence. Your stability became the standard people use to measure the credibility of everyone involved. And the contrast is striking, because the ones who tried to twist your image relied on emotional outbursts, exaggerated stories, and dramatic claims. But now people are realizing something important. When someone is telling the truth, their story doesn't need theatrics. When someone is lying, they rely on volume and dramatization to keep the audience engaged. And people are seeing through that now. There's something else happening too, something even more interesting. People who never knew you personally, people who only heard bits and pieces of the situation from a distance, are now speaking in your defense. They're saying things like, "I don't even know this person, but everything being said about them feels exaggerated. Something doesn't add up. Why are the critics more emotional than the person they're accusing? Why does the accused seem more grounded than the ones doing the blaming?" These questions carry weight. They carry influence. They create doubt around the false narrative. And once doubt enters the conversation, lies lose their power. You know why people are defending you? Because your energy never aligned with the accusations. Even people who don't know you personally can feel that. They can sense the disconnect. They can sense the desperation behind the attempts to discredit you. They can sense the internal chaos of the ones spreading negativity. But your presence communicates something entirely different, something they can trust, something they can lean on, something they can interpret as genuine without needing explanation. It isn't just about what you said. It's about how you carried yourself. It's about how you moved. It's about how you didn't break character when pressured. People trust patterns more than they trust claims. And your pattern has been consistent from the start. Dignity, control, confidence, stability. You didn't need to attack anyone to prove your point. You didn't need to lower your standards. You didn't need to expose anyone. You simply stood firm in who you are. And now, people are aligning with you because your actions speak louder than the accusations ever could. And as more people defend you, something bigger is happening. Your critics are losing their audience. Their voice isn't spreading anymore. Their influence isn't landing the same way. Their attempts to revive the narrative feel forced and transparent. People are uninterested. They're tired. They're done listening to exaggerated claims. When people defend you, they aren't just supporting you. They're rejecting the ones who tried to mislead them. And that rejection feels like a collapse of credibility, a collapse of control, a collapse of the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. The shift in public perception is happening quietly, but it's happening powerfully. Conversations are changing. Tone is changing. People who once sided with your opponents out of convenience are switching sides now because they finally feel safe enough to acknowledge the truth. They don't fear backlash anymore. They don't fear being targeted for defending you. The collective support is strong enough to overshadow any pushback, and that makes it easier for more voices to join in. Now the majority is leaning toward your truth, and that majority is loud enough to drown out the last fragments of the manufactured narrative. Your critics are panicking because they can sense they're losing grip. Every new defense made in your favor feels like another blow to the version of events they tried to sell. Every person who speaks up for you makes them feel exposed. Every quiet observer who suddenly questions them feels like another step toward accountability. And accountability is the last thing they want. But here's the part they never prepared for. The conversations aren't happening in front of them. They're happening behind their backs, in places they can't control, among people they never imagined would question them. And once people form their own conclusions, there's nothing your critics can do to reverse it. The narrative has shifted. The perception has evolved. The truth has taken center stage without needing permission. And amid all of this, your image is transforming. You're no longer seen as the target. You're seen as the survivor. You're seen as the grounded one. You're seen as the person who handled something unfair, with more strength than the people who created it. That transformation is powerful because it elevates your position in ways no defense statement ever could. When people defend you, they give you power. When people correct lies about you, they give you validation without you seeking it. When people stand beside you, they build a foundation that cannot be broken. This is the new momentum you're stepping into, the phase where truth gains speed, the phase where the narrative reconstructs itself, the phase where the real story begins to surface, not through your voice, but through the voices of everyone who now feels compelled to protect your name. And this momentum isn't slowing down. It's only growing stronger, because now people are not just defending you, they're preparing to take the next step. They're ready to expose inconsistencies. They're ready to dismantle the false narrative entirely. They're ready to bring forward the parts that were hidden to protect the wrong people. They're ready to question everything that was accepted without evidence. And this shift, this collective awakening, is leading directly into the next stage of this story, where the truth not only becomes clear, it becomes undeniable. This is the moment where the energy around you evolves into something sharper, something more direct, something that refuses to let lies breathe. The same individuals who once stayed quiet because they didn't want to get involved are now stepping forward because they can no longer tolerate the disconnect between what was said about you and who you truly are. Their voices are not whispers anymore. They're deliberate, confident, and pointed, as if each sentence they speak carries its own weight of accountability. People are not simply observing the truth, they're carrying it, they're delivering it, they're pushing it into every room where your name has ever been misunderstood. And the reason this shift is so strong now is because people have seen too much. They've seen the contradictions in the original accusations. They've seen the emotional instability of the ones who tried to damage you. They've seen how the story kept changing, how certain details were exaggerated, how certain moments were selectively presented to paint you negatively. They've watched the accusers fall apart under their own narrative. And now that enough time has passed, the truth has become too visible to deny. When people defend you now, it's not out of sympathy, it's out of clarity. They're not standing with you because they feel bad. They're standing with you because they've recognized who was honest and who was deceptive. They saw how you moved with consistency while others shifted their tone depending on who they were talking to. They saw how your actions remained stable while the other side kept scrambling to maintain a version of events that didn't match reality. And the more people look closely, the more they realized that the truth was always sitting in plain view. They just needed distance from the noise to recognize it. The conversations around you now carry a different tone. People aren't just saying, "I think they're innocent." They're saying, the story they told about them was never true. They're saying, "I should have questioned it earlier." They're saying, "This makes so much more sense now." These are the kinds of statements that don't just defend you. They dismantle the accusations at their roots. They rewrite the social memory of what happened. They shift the weight of accountability onto the correct shoulders. And your opponents feel it. They feel the tightening pressure of being questioned. They feel the growing discomfort of knowing people are connecting dots they hoped would stay scattered. They feel the eyes turning toward them. They feel the responsibility creeping in. They feel the consequences they thought they could outrun starting to catch up. And the silence they once weaponized against you is now suffocating them. Because when people defend you in groups, when the collective opinion shifts, the ones who lied feel cornered, not through confrontation, but through exposure. They can sense they're losing the ability to shape perception. They can sense the narrative slipping from their hands. They can sense that their version of events is no longer being accepted as truth. And that loss of control terrifies them more than anything you could have ever done in retaliation. You see, this is the part they never expected. People weren't supposed to question them. People weren't supposed to analyze the situation deeply. People weren't supposed to look at your behavior and compare it to theirs. But they did. And that comparison destroyed everything they tried to build. Every lie they crafted now looks fragile. Every accusation they made now looks like projection. Every emotional outburst they used to manipulate perception now looks like a confession. The shift didn't happen because you argued. It didn't happen because you pleaded your case. It didn't happen because you demanded people listen. It happened because truth, when given enough time, exposes everything around it. Your consistency revealed their instability. Your calm revealed their chaos. Your honesty revealed their desperation. People saw that contrast and instinctively gravitated toward you, not because you pushed them, but because the truth pulled them. And now, something even more powerful is happening. People are starting to speak up in places where your critics cannot interfere. Group conversations, private messages, discussions behind closed doors. People are drawing their own conclusions without being influenced, and those conclusions are aligning with your side more and more each day. You have become the person they trust, not because you tried to convince them, but because your behavior earned it. This is the final stage where truth transforms into influence, where your character becomes a reference point in every discussion, where people use your composure as the standard to judge the accusers. And once people adopt that standard, the false narrative has no room left to breathe. Every exaggeration becomes obvious. Every fabricated detail becomes transparent. Every emotionally driven claim becomes suspicious. And this suspicion spreads faster than any lie ever could. People defending you is not just social support. It is social correction. It is a recalibration of reputation. It is a rebalancing of truth. And that correction is happening now with full force. People are standing up not because they must, but because they want to. Because they've seen the injustice. Because they've seen the real you. Because they've seen how unfair the situation was. And because they can no longer watch deception win. This is why the atmosphere around you feels so different. This is why the energy feels charged. This is why the conversations feel heavy. Because this isn't just defense anymore. This is rectification. It's the world correcting itself. It's the truth claiming its place. It's the moment where everything flips, where everything becomes transparent, where everything becomes undeniable. And this is where the ripple becomes a wave, where the wave becomes a force, and where the force becomes a turning point. Because once people begin stepping forward with certainty, the entire energy around your situation starts shifting in a way that no one can deny. You can feel it, even if no one says it directly. You can see it in how people adjust their posture around you, in how they hesitate before repeating old assumptions, in how they double-check details they used to echo without thinking. It's subtle at first, small pauses, restrained reactions, cautious evaluations, but then it grows. It becomes visible. T becomes consistent. It becomes accepted. People who once believed whatever narrative they were handed now question everything before letting it pass through their mind. They no longer swallow what they're fed. They analyze, they verify, they compare actions with words, results with claims, patterns with behavior. And every time they run that internal comparison, the same conclusion returns. You were done wrong, and they can no longer pretend otherwise. This is what real defense looks like. Not noise, not chaos, not confrontational energy. It's steady, grounded clarity. It's awareness turning into alignment. It's recognition turning into loyalty. People aren't defending you out of sympathy. They're defending you because the evidence is now too strong to ignore. And that makes your position powerful in a way that goes beyond words, beyond arguments, beyond any attempt that was made to distort the truth about you. What's happening now is collective realization, and collective realization is something no individual can stop. Once a group starts to understand what really happened, once they start piecing together the parts that never made sense, once they start comparing timelines and behavior and reactions, the narrative built against you collapses under its own weight. It can't sustain itself anymore. It had too many holes, too many contradictions, too many exaggerated claims, too many emotional manipulations designed to make you look like the problem when you were actually the one absorbing the damage. And the people who once stayed neutral, they're no longer neutral. They're leaning toward you because clarity pushes them there. They're leaning toward you because self-respect pushes them there. They're leaning toward you because seeing reality clearly forces them to recognize who was genuine and who was performative. And the more they lean, the more others begin to lean with them. That's how momentum builds, not through shouting matches, but through shifts in perception. And these shifts have already begun spreading. You can see it in the way people talk now. You can see it in the way they correct misinformation, even casually. You can see it in the way they annotate conversations with, "Actually, that's not what happened." Or, "I remember a completely different version." Or, "Wait, that doesn't match what we've seen." Those small corrections are not small. They're pressure points. They're disruptions in the script that was forced on everyone. And each disruption weakens the false story that was once used to isolate you. What's fascinating is how predictable this stage is. The truth always resurfaces. It just takes time for people to see what they were manipulated into ignoring. The ones who created the false narrative expected no one to question it. They counted on people being passive. They counted on people being easily influenced. They counted on people not paying attention. But people are paying attention now. And once attention shifts, protection forms on its own. It's not something you request. It's not something you push for. It's something people decide. And their decision carries far more weight than anything you could have said on your own. Because when people choose to defend someone based on their own realization, their voice becomes even stronger than the truth itself. Their voice becomes proof of the truth. And that's exactly what's happening now. Oh, people aren't just defending you. They're owning the defense. They're taking responsibility for correcting the narrative because they see the consequences of letting lies spread unchecked. They see how unfairness grows when no one challenges it. They see how manipulation spreads when it's left unaddressed. They see how easily a reputation can be distorted when the loudest voice wins by default. But now the loudest voice isn't the one that attacked you. The loudest voice is the collective, aligned, awakened group that finally sees what was really going on. And their voice speaks with unity, confidence, and first-hand understanding. And this newfound unity, it makes the people who tried to twist the story extremely uncomfortable. They can't control the narrative anymore. They can't direct the conversation. They can't use exaggeration as a weapon. They can't rely on misdirection. They can't hide behind emotional manipulation. Because now, everything they say is being evaluated through a different lens. Instead of being believed, their words are being dissected. Instead of sounding convincing, their reactions look defensive. Instead of appearing confident, they appear unstable. And that shift is what destroys the illusion they built. Once the crowd stops believing the magician, every trick falls flat. But here's the most powerful part. You didn't have to attack anyone to make this happen. You didn't have to fight for your reputation. You didn't have to beg anyone to understand. You didn't have to defend yourself loudly. Your truth defended itself. Your character did the work. Your consistency carried the weight. And now, the people who once questioned you are the ones protecting you. The people who doubted you are the ones validating you. The people who distanced themselves are now coming closer with humility because they finally see the full picture they once overlooked. That reversal is not accidental. It's natural. When someone has integrity, the truth eventually reveals them. And when someone doesn't, the truth eventually exposes them. You're witnessing that exposure unfold in real time. But what comes next is even stronger. Not only will people defend you and correct the narrative, they'll start openly rejecting the version of events that was used to frame you. They'll start rejecting the lies. They'll start rejecting the manipulative tactics. They'll start rejecting the person who orchestrated the distortion. And that collective rejection carries more impact than anything you could have done alone. It's the final phase of this shift, where the truth becomes not just visible, but dominant. And when the truth becomes dominant, your position rises without effort. Your name clears without explanation. Your image strengthens without strategy. And the people who once tried to spin stories about you, they become irrelevant because the truth already won. And now, people are making sure everyone knows it.